The morning inside the prison started the same way it always did. The sound of heavy doors clanging open, guards shouting numbers, and men slowly stepping out of their cells. The air smelled of bleach and weak coffee. Most of the inmates moved without saying a word, half asleep, half aware, just trying to get through another day. Among them was a quiet man named Daniel. He had been there for years, long enough to know when to talk and when to stay silent. Daniel wasn't like most of the others. He didn't try to act tough or prove himself. He mostly kept to his routine, working in the kitchen, reading books when he could, and keeping his head low. He had learned early on that inside these walls, peace was something you had to build yourself. He had no close friends, just people he nodded to during meals or when passing in the corridor. But there was something different in the air lately. The place felt tense. The guards walked faster, their eyes sharper than usual. Whispers passed from one inmate to another like smoke. Everyone knew something was brewing, though no one said it out loud. The two main groups in the prison had been clashing quietly for weeks. Reed, an older inmate who had a strong presence, led one side. Cole, a younger and fiery man who had arrived recently, was building his own following. Both had pride, both wanted control, and everyone could feel that a storm was coming. Daniel tried to ignore it. He'd seen fights before, but this felt different. He could sense it in the way people stared at each other during breakfast, in the way guards kept a hand near their radios. Even small things like who sat where in the cafeteria suddenly mattered. That morning, Daniel stood by the sink in the kitchen, washing trays while others prepared lunch. He worked quietly, lost in his thoughts. The kitchen was one of the few places he felt almost human again. The smell of onions and bread reminded him of home, of normal life before everything went wrong. He didn't talk much, but the older cook, a kind man everyone called Red, sometimes cracked jokes to keep the mood light. "You notice how quiet it is today?" Red said, glancing around. "Feels like the air's holding its breath." Daniel nodded but didn't answer. He could feel it too. The calm before something bad. Around noon, the prisoners lined up for lunch. The guards stood watch from the corners, pretending everything was under control. Daniel handed out trays of stew one by one, his eyes scanning the room. He saw Reed sitting at his usual table, calm but alert, surrounded by his men. On the far side, Cole and his group sat together, whispering and laughing in a way that didn't feel natural. Then it happened. One of Cole's men bumped into Reed's second-in-command near the drink counter. A few words were exchanged, no one heard exactly what, but suddenly a tray flew across the room. Food splattered on the wall, and silence filled the cafeteria for a heartbeat. Then chaos exploded. Men jumped to their feet. Chairs crashed. Someone yelled. The guards rushed in, shouting for everyone to get down. But no one listened. Fists swung, bodies collided, and the noise was deafening. Daniel froze for a second, gripping the counter. He had seen fights before, but never like this. It wasn't just anger, it was planned. He ducked behind the counter as a guard blew his whistle. More guards stormed in, but it was already too late. The fight had spread to every corner. Daniel could see Reed trying to pull his men back, shouting for control, while Cole's people kept pushing forward. It was clear now this wasn't about a spilled drink. This was the spark they had all been waiting for. Within minutes, alarms blared across the prison. The loud, piercing sound echoed through the walls. Red grabbed Daniel's arm. "We need to move," he shouted. Together, they slipped out the side door as guards herded inmates to the floor. Smoke from the kitchen's broken stove filled the hallway, making it hard to see. Daniel's heart pounded as they ran toward the back corridor. Outside the cafeteria, the scene was even worse. Inmates who hadn't been part of the fight were being locked down, but some took advantage of the confusion to run. A few guards were pinned down near the stairwell, calling for help on their radios. Daniel and Red stayed low, trying not to draw attention. They reached the laundry area and stopped to catch their breath. Daniel leaned against the wall, sweating, trying to process what had just happened. "It's bad," he said quietly. Red nodded. "It's more than bad. It started. The next hour was pure confusion. Orders shouted through speakers, doors locking and unlocking, guards running from one block to another. Some inmates pounded on their cell doors, demanding answers. Others stayed quiet, waiting to see how far it would go. Daniel managed to return to his cell before the main lockdown hit. As the heavy door slammed shut behind him, he sat on the edge of his bunk staring at the floor. The noise outside continued, boots stomping, metal clanging, voices echoing down the corridor. He thought about how quickly everything had fallen apart. One moment it was an ordinary day, the next the whole place was on fire. He wondered if anyone had been hurt. He wondered how far the fight would spread. But mostly, he wondered if this was only the beginning. That night the prison was locked tight. No movement, no lights except the dim glow from the hallway. Daniel lay awake listening. Somewhere in the distance he could hear faint shouting like someone arguing, then silence. When morning came, the air was heavy with tension. The guards looked tired, their voices rough from yelling all night. No one said much at breakfast. People avoided eye contact. The cafeteria, once loud and crowded, felt like a ghost town. Even Reed and Cole were nowhere to be seen. Daniel kept to himself. He ate slowly, his hands shaking a little. Every sound made him flinch. The clank of a tray, the buzz of a door, the echo of footsteps. He had learned long ago that fear was contagious inside prison walls. If one man panicked, it spread fast. So he forced himself to stay calm, even though he could feel his heart racing. Later that day, while mopping the floor in the corridor, Daniel overheard two guards talking near the corner. One said, "They say a few guys took control of the West Wing last night." The other replied, "Yeah, and they still haven't got it back." Daniel froze. He didn't look up, just kept mopping. But inside, his stomach turned. The fight wasn't over, it was spreading. The thought of the prisoners taking over part of the building didn't feel real, yet somehow it made sense. It explained the tension, the silence, the fear on everyone's faces. By evening, the warden's voice echoed through the intercom. He warned that anyone caught participating in further violence would face isolation. But the threat felt empty. Everyone knew the situation was already out of control. Daniel sat on his bunk that night, staring at the wall. The sounds outside had changed, less shouting, more whispering. It was the kind of quiet that came before something big. He thought about Red, about Reed and Cole, and about how fast things could turn inside this place. He didn't know it yet, but that day was only the beginning of something that would shake the prison to its core. As the lights dimmed, Daniel lay down, his mind racing. The walls that had trapped him for years suddenly felt alive, listening, waiting, and somewhere deep inside he felt that tomorrow nothing would be the same. The next morning started with an uneasy silence. The usual shouting of guards and the loud clatter of metal doors opening was replaced by quiet, controlled voices. The prison didn't feel like a place running on rules anymore. It felt like a place holding its breath. Daniel woke up early, though he hadn't really slept. The air in his cell felt thick and heavy. He sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the faint light slipping through the bars. It was too still. In prison, silence never meant peace. It meant trouble waiting to happen. When the guards finally walked by, they didn't make eye contact. They moved quickly, checking each cell but saying nothing. Daniel could tell something was wrong from the way they avoided conversation. After breakfast, the inmates were told to stay inside their blocks. No work, no yard time. That alone made people restless. Men leaned against the bars, whispering to each other about what they'd heard. Some said that the fight from the day before had turned into a full standoff overnight. Others said a few prisoners were missing, hiding somewhere in the West Wing. Daniel didn't know what to believe, but he did know that the balance inside the prison had shifted. Once that kind of power slipped from the guards' hands, it never came back easily. By midday, a loud alarm echoed through the building. Everyone froze. The guards ran down the corridor, shouting orders, keys jangling. Daniel stood near the door, trying to listen. He could hear the faint sound of metal hitting metal, like someone was trying to break through something. Then came the shouting. The sound came from the far side of the building, the west corridor. The same place Daniel had overheard the guards talking about yesterday. Something big was happening there. Minutes later, a voice shouted from the lower level, "They've taken it! They've got the West Wing!" The news spread like wildfire. Every inmate in the block started talking at once. Some cheered quietly. Others looked scared. Daniel didn't move. He just stood there staring through the bars, trying to make sense of it all. Soon after, the power flickered. The lights blinked off for a moment before coming back on. That was when Daniel realized the situation was much worse than he thought. If the prisoners had control of the West Wing, that meant they had access to the electrical room, and maybe even the control systems. Hours passed and no one came to open the cells. The guards were busy trying to regain control. By evening, the tension was unbearable. The men started banging on their cell doors, yelling for food, water, or news. The noise grew louder and louder until finally, someone in authority shouted through the intercom, "Everyone stay calm. Do not leave your cells. The situation is under control." But Daniel could hear the panic in his voice. The situation was not under control. That night, Daniel couldn't stay still. The air was hot and dry, and the shouting never stopped completely. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear banging, like someone was trying to break through a gate. Every once in a while, a burst of static came through the speakers, followed by short commands from the guards. But even those grew less frequent as the night went on. By morning, the whole prison felt different. Some cells were still locked, but others weren't. The noise had shifted too. It wasn't chaos yet, but it was close. Daniel could hear men moving through the halls, voices echoing. He pressed his ear to the door, trying to figure out what was happening. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, heavy ones. Someone was walking down the hall, but it wasn't a guard. A few moments later, a familiar voice called out, "Anyone here from Block C?" It was Reed. Daniel stepped forward and spoke through the small gap in the door. "Reed, what's happening?" Reed's voice was calm but serious. "The West Wing's under inmate control." The guards pulled back. "Nobody knows what's next." Daniel felt a chill go through him. "What about the warden?" "No one's seen him since last night," Reed said. "They're saying the phones are cut off. No contact with the outside." Daniel didn't know what to say. He had always imagined prison as a place that couldn't lose control. Not completely. But now it was happening. Inside those walls, the rules were changing. Later in the afternoon, the sound of shouting returned, this time louder, more desperate. Reed and a few others ran past the cells. "They're moving toward the kitchen," someone yelled. "They want control of the food." Daniel's stomach tightened. He remembered the kitchen well. He knew how important that area was. In prison, whoever controlled the food controlled the people. Minutes later, smoke started rising from the lower level. The alarms went off again and guards shouted for backup. But there were too many prisoners and too few officers. Daniel could hear the chaos spreading. Some men cheered, others shouted in fear. The sound was wild and endless. Suddenly, the cell doors clicked. Daniel's heart skipped. The lock had disengaged. He stepped out slowly, unsure if it was a trap or a malfunction. Around him, other inmates did the same. Moving carefully, eyes darting around, the hallways were filled with shouting. Daniel saw a group of inmates running with makeshift sticks and broom handles, trying to take control of the corridor. He pressed against the wall, trying to stay out of their way. He didn't want to be part of whatever was coming. He just wanted to stay alive. As he moved toward the kitchen, the heat from the fire hit him. The smoke was thick, making it hard to breathe. He saw Red there coughing, trying to put out the flames near the stove with a wet towel. "Daniel," Red called out. "Help me with this." They managed to smother the small fire, though smoke still filled the air. The kitchen was in chaos. Pots overturned, food scattered, men shouting orders at each other. Some wanted to use the food to bargain with the guards. Others just wanted to eat. Reed showed up again, this time covered in sweat, his shirt torn. "We need to keep things calm," he said firmly. "If this turns into a war, nobody wins." Cole's voice came from the doorway. "Too late for calm," he said, stepping in with his men behind him. The room froze. For a moment, no one spoke. The tension between the two leaders was heavy, almost physical. Daniel stood near the counter, his heart pounding. He could see that both men were trying to figure out what to do next. Finally, Reed spoke. "We can't keep this going. The guards will come in any minute." Cole shook his head. "They're scared. We've got control. We can make demands." "What demands?" Reed asked. "Better treatment, real food, fewer beatings. We hold them until they listen." Daniel watched the exchange silently. Both men had points. The prisoners had been treated harshly for years. But taking control like this could only end badly. Still, no one dared say it out loud. The argument continued for minutes until the sound of boots echoed in the hallway. Everyone turned. The guards were regrouping. You could hear the sharp, disciplined rhythm of their steps approaching. "Everyone back," Reed shouted. "Don't give them a reason." But some of Cole's men didn't listen. They wanted to show power. They blocked the door, shouting threats, then, without warning, a loud bang shook the room. It wasn't a gun. It was a warning shot from outside, meant to scare them back. It worked. The noise sent everyone ducking for cover. When the smoke cleared, the guards had sealed the outer doors. They weren't coming in. They were cutting the section off. The prisoners were trapped inside, surrounded but not captured. Daniel sat down near the corner, coughing from the smoke. Red looked at him and said quietly, "This place is going to break before it bends." Daniel didn't answer. He just stared at the flickering light above them, realizing how quickly the line between order and chaos had vanished. Inside those walls, everything had changed. And deep down, he knew the worst part was still to come. The smell of smoke still hung in the air the next morning. The kitchen was a mess. Burned trays, broken dishes, and half-spoiled food scattered across the floor. Daniel sat near the back door, his head resting against the cold wall. He hadn't slept all night. The prison was too loud. Shouts, footsteps, and distant crashes filled the air. It was hard to believe this was the same place where he used to count his days quietly. Now time didn't seem to move at all. The guards had sealed off most of the corridors, and the inmates who'd taken control of the West Wing refused to surrender. It wasn't just a fight anymore. It was a standoff. Reed and Cole had somehow agreed to stop fighting each other for now. Both sides had realized that if they kept clashing, no one would survive what came next. So they formed a shaky agreement. Together, they would hold the captured sections and try to talk to the warden. But there was no trust between them. Every glance, every word felt like it was sitting on a thin line. One mistake and everything would collapse again. Daniel tried to stay out of it, but it wasn't that simple anymore. Because he had worked in the kitchen, everyone came to him for food. That gave him a strange kind of power he didn't want. Some of the men from Reed's side asked him to ration the food carefully, while Cole's group demanded he give them more for their people. Daniel felt trapped in the middle. That afternoon, Reed called him over. He was standing near the kitchen door, looking tired but alert. "I need you to do something for me," he said. Daniel hesitated. "What is it?" "There's going to be a talk between us and Cole's people," Reed said quietly. "We need someone both sides can trust to carry messages. You don't pick sides. You keep your head. That's what we need right now," Daniel frowned. "Why me?" "Because you're not one of us or one of them, and because everyone knows you don't want trouble." Daniel didn't answer right away. He didn't like the idea of walking between two groups that hated each other. But deep down, he knew Reed was right. If no one tried to keep things calm, the whole prison would burn down. He finally nodded. "All right, I'll do it." That evening, Daniel walked through the narrow hallway that connected the kitchen to the west corridor. The place looked like a war zone. Broken lights flickered, paint was peeling from the walls, and the air was heavy with the smell of sweat and burned rubber. He could hear people whispering behind doors, afraid to step out. Cole's group was camped near the old laundry room. When Daniel walked in, they turned to look at him, suspicious. Cole stood at the center, his arms crossed. His eyes were sharp, always watching. "What's he doing here?" one of his men asked. "He's the messenger," Cole said after a moment. "Let him speak." Daniel handed over a folded piece of paper Reed had given him. It wasn't fancy. Just a list of things they wanted to discuss: food supply, injured inmates, and how to avoid another riot. Cole read it slowly, then looked at Daniel. "You tell Reed I'll talk," he said. "But I'm not backing down. We're not handing over the West Wing until we get something real." "What do you want?" Daniel asked carefully. Cole's voice hardened. "We want to be treated like humans." "That's it? No more beatings, no more hunger, no more being locked up for days for nothing." Daniel nodded. He understood. He'd seen the way some of the guards treated them, like animals, not people. But he also knew that nothing about this situation would end cleanly. When Daniel brought the message back to Reed, he listened quietly. "He's angry," Daniel said. "But he's not trying to destroy everything. He just wants to be heard." Reed nodded slowly. "Then maybe there's still a chance to fix this before it gets worse." The next 2 days passed in slow motion. The prison remained in lockdown. The guards stayed out of the captured areas, waiting for orders. Inside, Daniel kept moving between both sides, delivering messages, calming arguments, trying to keep the peace. It wasn't easy. Tempers flared quickly. People were hungry, scared, and tired. At one point, Daniel found 2 men fighting over a loaf of bread. He stepped between them and shouted for them to stop. "We're all trapped in here," he said, his voice shaking. "If we turn on each other, we're done." The men hesitated, then backed off. But Daniel could see the fear in their eyes. Everyone knew this couldn't last much longer. By the third night, the mood had changed. The noise had quieted down, but not because things were better. People were just exhausted. Daniel sat with Red near the kitchen fire, sharing the last bit of soup they had made. Red stirred the pot slowly. "You ever think about how we got here?" he said. Daniel looked at him. "Every day," Red sighed. "All it takes is one spark. One small thing, and the whole place turns upside down." Daniel didn't answer. He was thinking about his family, about how far away the outside world felt now. The walls didn't just keep people in, they swallowed them. Suddenly the radio crackled. It was faint at first, just static. Then came a voice, calm and firm. "This is the warden. We are aware of your situation. We want a peaceful resolution. Anyone who lays down their weapons and returns to their cells will not be harmed." Everyone froze. The voice echoed through the halls, repeating the same message. Cole's men didn't like it. "They're lying," one of them said. "They'll punish us the second we surrender." Reed's people were split too. Some wanted to take the offer, others didn't. Daniel could see it happening again, the fragile peace cracking apart. He stood up and shouted, "Stop! Just listen. If you fight again, they'll come in full force." Nobody's walking away from that. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was heavy. Then Cole turned toward him. "You think they'll keep their word?" Daniel hesitated. "I don't know. But I know this, if we don't stop now, we'll lose everything." Reed nodded. "He's right." That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He walked the halls quietly, his footsteps echoing in the dark. The faces he passed looked worn and hopeless. Some men were praying quietly. Others just stared at the floor. When he reached the west corridor, he stopped and looked out the narrow window. Beyond the walls, flashing lights from police cars and emergency vehicles glowed in the distance. The outside world was right there, and yet it felt unreachable. Suddenly he heard a noise behind him, a door creaking open. One of Cole's men stepped out holding a radio. "They're saying the guards are planning to move in at dawn," he whispered. Daniel's heart sank. He knew what that meant. The standoff was about to end one way or another. He went back to find Reed and told him everything. "We don't have much time," Daniel said. "You need to make a decision before they do." Reed rubbed his face with his hands. "If we give up now, they'll punish us for this. And if you don't," Daniel said softly, "they'll storm this place." The older man looked at him for a long moment. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Daniel. You don't belong in this mess." Daniel shook his head. "None of us do." As the night faded into early morning, Daniel sat in silence, watching the first light creep through the windows. The noise outside was growing louder, voices, engines, movement. He knew the next few hours would decide everything. He closed his eyes and whispered to himself, "Just one more day. One more day to stay alive." The walls around him seemed to breathe. Inside those cracked, cold walls, power was shifting again. No one knew who would have control by the end of the day. All they knew was that something was about to break. And once it did, nothing inside those prison walls would ever be the same again. The morning light crept through the tiny window of Daniel's cell, soft and pale. But it brought no comfort. The whole prison was too quiet, as if everyone was holding their breath before something big. The air was thick with worry and smoke from the fires that had burned all night. Daniel sat on his bunk, staring at the wall. His hands were shaking slightly, though he tried to hide it even from himself. He had spent most of the night talking with Reed, trying to convince him to find a way to end things peacefully. But peace inside a prison wasn't easy to find once chaos had started. Outside, heavy footsteps echoed through the hall. Voices carried down the corridor, short, sharp commands from guards preparing for something. Daniel knew what that meant. The officers were getting ready to take the prison back by force. He stepped into the hallway where Reed was already waiting, his face pale but calm. "They're coming," Reed said simply. Daniel nodded. "Then we have to move fast." Together they walked toward the kitchen area, where most of the inmates were gathered. The mood there was tense and uneven. Some were pacing restlessly, others sitting in silence with tired eyes. Cole was standing near the doorway, surrounded by his group. The air between him and Reed was cold, though neither wanted another fight now. "The guards are setting up outside," Reed said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "We don't have much time. We can either fight them and lose, or we can do this smart." Cole folded his arms. "Smart, you mean give up?" Reed didn't flinch. "I mean survive. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the broken light above them. Then one of Cole's men ran in, out of breath. "They're cutting through the gate," he shouted. "They'll be inside in minutes." Panic swept through the room like fire. People started shouting, grabbing whatever they could use to defend themselves. Daniel stepped forward, raising his voice. "Stop, you'll only make it worse. They've got everything, shields, gas, weapons. You fight, you die," but fear had taken over. Some listened, but others didn't. Daniel could see it in their eyes, the desperation, the pride, the refusal to surrender. Reed turned to Daniel. "Can you talk to them? The guards, I mean. Maybe they'll listen to you." Daniel hesitated. The idea scared him. He wasn't a leader, just a man trying to survive. But he also knew that if someone didn't try, a lot of people were going to get hurt. "I'll try," he said quietly. He grabbed a white towel from the kitchen counter and tied it around a stick. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. As he stepped out of the kitchen, his heart pounded so hard he could barely hear anything else. The hallway was smoky, and the air stung his throat. The noise outside was getting louder. The guard shouting orders, the crack of boots on the floor, the clang of metal doors being forced open. When Daniel reached the end of the corridor, he raised the towel high and shouted, "Don't shoot! I just want to talk." For a second there was silence. Then a voice answered from the other side of the gate. "Who's there?" "My name's Daniel," he called out. "I'm not armed. I just want to stop this before it goes too far." There was another pause, then the same voice said, "Step forward slowly." Daniel walked carefully until he was close enough to see them, the guards in their gear, lined up and ready, faces hidden behind masks. The sight made his stomach twist. They looked more like soldiers than officers now. The guard in front lowered his weapon slightly. "You got 30 seconds, he said. Daniel took a deep breath. "There are people inside who want to surrender, but they're scared. If you rush in, someone's going to panic. We can stop this without anyone getting hurt." The guard glanced at the others behind him. "The warden says no more talking. You tell them to drop everything and get down, or we're coming in." Daniel looked at the line of men, their armor shining under the dim light. He could see that their decision had already been made. Still, he tried again. "Just give me 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. 5 minutes to calm them down." After a moment, the guard nodded reluctantly. "You've got 5. Then we move." Daniel ran back down the corridor, heart racing. He found Reed and Cole arguing again near the kitchen. "They'll be inside in 5 minutes, he said. "If we don't do something now, this place will be a bloodbath." Reed closed his eyes for a second, then looked around at the men. "Listen up," he shouted. "No more fighting. Everyone stay where you are. Anyone who wants to live, drop whatever's in your hand." Cole looked at him with disbelief. "You're surrendering?" Reed's voice softened. "I'm ending it." Cole's jaw tightened. "You think they'll forgive us for this?" Reed stared at him for a long moment. "Maybe not. But they'll remember we didn't kill anyone when we could have." For the first time, Cole didn't argue. He just looked away. Daniel moved quickly through the corridors, telling everyone he saw to stay calm, to keep their hands visible, to sit down. Some listened right away. Others needed convincing. But slowly, the noise began to fade. Then came a sound that made everyone freeze, the sharp crack of metal being cut through. The gates were opening. A few seconds later, the guards flooded in, shouting orders, lights flashing. Daniel raised his hands and stepped forward. "They're not fighting," he yelled. "No one's resisting." The guards hesitated for a moment, seeing that it was true. Most of the inmates were sitting against the walls, hands up. The chaos that had ruled the prison for days was suddenly replaced by a heavy, stunned silence. But not everyone had given up. From the far corner, one of Cole's men made a run for it, shouting angrily. The sound of the struggle echoed through the hallway. Daniel's instinct kicked in. He ran toward them without thinking. "Stop," he shouted, grabbing the man's arm. "It's over." The man froze, breathing hard. His eyes darted around, realizing the fight was pointless now. He slowly dropped the piece of metal he'd been holding. Daniel stepped back, chest heaving. The guard nearest to him lowered his weapon slightly and said quietly, "Good job, kid." By the time the sun was fully up, the prison was under control again. The guards moved carefully through every section, checking for weapons, locking doors, counting heads. The men who had started the riot were separated and taken away. The rest were sent back to their cells, one block at a time. Daniel sat in the corner of the kitchen, his clothes covered in dust, his hands trembling. The noise had stopped. For the first time in days, there was silence. Not the tense kind, but the heavy, empty kind that comes after chaos. Red found him sitting there and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did good," he said softly. Daniel didn't answer. He just stared at the floor, lost in thought. He couldn't believe how close they had come to losing everything. Later that evening, Reed was escorted away by guards. As he passed Daniel, he gave a small nod. There were no words, but the look said enough. "Thank you." When night came, Daniel lay on his bunk, staring up at the ceiling. His body was tired, but his mind wouldn't stop. He thought about all the things he had seen, the fear, the anger, the small moments of courage. He realized that sometimes strength wasn't about fighting or winning. It was about standing in the middle of chaos and finding the will to calm it. Outside, the prison lights glowed against the dark sky. The walls still stood tall, cold and unchanging. But inside those walls, something had shifted. The power that once ruled through fear had been broken, even if only for a moment. As Daniel closed his eyes, a faint sense of peace washed over him. The day had been long and cruel, but he had survived it. And in that quiet moment, he knew that when the tables turned inside those prison walls, it wasn't just power that changed. It was people. Weeks passed after the chaos, and the prison felt strangely quiet. The noise, the shouting, the fear that had once filled every corner had faded into a heavy silence. The walls still stood tall and gray, but something inside them had changed. The guards walked with a little more caution now, and the inmates spoke in lower tones. Everyone had seen too much. Everyone had lost a little piece of themselves in those few terrible days. Daniel sat on the edge of his bunk one morning, staring at the streak of light that slipped through the narrow window. The cold air carried the faint sounds of the outside world. A truck starting, a bird somewhere in the distance. He hadn't heard those things clearly in a long time. They reminded him that life still existed beyond these walls, and that maybe, just maybe, he'd get to be a part of it again one day. A soft knock came on the bars. "Daniel," said a voice. It was Reed. His face looked older, more worn, but his eyes were calm. He had been moved to a different block after the riot, but was brought back occasionally for cleanup duty. "You holding up?" Daniel nodded. "Trying to." Reed leaned against the bars. "They say there'll be hearings soon, investigations, maybe some changes." He smiled faintly. "Guess something good had to come out of all that mess." Daniel looked down at his hands. "You think they'll listen?" Reed shrugged. "They don't have much choice. What happened shook everyone. Even the warden's pretending to care now." There was a long silence. Then Reed said quietly, "You did something no one else could have done. You stopped it before it got worse." Daniel shook his head. "I just talked. That's all." "Sometimes," Reed said. "That's the hardest thing to do in a place like this." When Reed left, Daniel sat there thinking about those words. Talking, listening. Those were the things that had seemed so small before, but now they felt like the only real power anyone had inside. Days went by, each one blending into the next. The prison slowly went back to its routines, morning counts, meal lines, work assignments. But there was still a tension in the air, a quiet unease that never quite went away. One afternoon, a counselor named Lewis came to see Daniel. He was new, brought in after the riot to help rebuild order and maybe understand what had gone wrong. "You're Daniel, right?" Lewis said, sitting down across from him in the small interview room. "I've heard a lot about you." Daniel gave a half smile. "I hope not all bad," Lewis chuckled. "Actually, the opposite. The staff said you helped keep things from turning worse that night." "That takes courage." Daniel didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to being called brave. For most of his life, he had only done what he needed to survive. Lewis studied him for a moment. "Do you ever think about what you'll do when you get out?" Daniel looked at the table between them. "If I get out," he said softly. "You will," Lewis replied. "And when you do, you've got choices. You've seen what happens when anger runs everything. Maybe you can help others see it too." Those words stayed with him long after the meeting ended. Later that evening, when Daniel returned to his cell, he found a folded piece of paper under his pillow. It was a short note from Reed. "They're moving me tomorrow. Probably upstate. Don't know if I'll see you again. But remember what you did here, it mattered. Keep your head up. You changed something, even if no one else ever says it out loud? Daniel read the note twice before tucking it carefully into a small corner of his mattress. He didn't know what to feel, sadness, pride, or just emptiness. Maybe all three. The next morning, when the guards led Reed out, Daniel watched from the far end of the hallway. Reed didn't look back, but he lifted one hand slightly in a quiet wave. That was enough. After that, life went on. The prison rebuilt. The guards changed shifts, and the days continued to pass, slow and heavy. But Daniel wasn't the same anymore. He started spending his free time in the library, a place most inmates ignored. The room was small and dusty, but peaceful. He found himself drawn to books about people who had gone through hard times and come out stronger. He didn't know it yet, but he was slowly rebuilding himself too. One afternoon, he noticed a young inmate sitting alone at one of the tables, staring blankly at a torn page. The kid looked scared, too new to understand how to survive here. Daniel hesitated for a moment, then walked over and sat down across from him. "You're new," Daniel said gently. The boy nodded without looking up. "A few weeks," Daniel leaned back. "Rough start?" The boy shrugged. "Feels like the world forgot about me." Daniel looked at him for a long moment. He understood that feeling better than anyone. "It's not about the world remembering you," he said quietly. "It's about you remembering yourself." The boy finally looked up, confused but listening. Daniel smiled a little. "You'll get through it. Just stay calm. Keep your head down, but don't lose who you are. That's how you survive." That small moment stayed with Daniel long after he left the library. It reminded him of something Reed once said, that strength wasn't about winning fights, it was about helping someone else stand when they're about to fall. Months passed, and the hearings finally began. Investigators came in, asking questions about what happened during the riot. Some inmates lied to protect themselves, others blamed the guards, and a few stayed quiet. But when it was Daniel's turn, he told the truth. Everything he'd seen, everything he'd done. When he finished, one of the investigators asked, "Why did you risk yourself that night?" Daniel thought for a moment before answering. "Because someone had to." Those 4 words hung in the air. Simple but enough. Not long after, changes started to happen. The warden was replaced. The guards received new training. The tension inside the prison began to ease just a little. It wasn't perfect. Nothing in a place like that ever was, but there was a small shift toward something better. Daniel didn't take credit for it. He didn't talk about it much at all. But deep down, he knew he had been part of that change. A year later, Daniel was called to the office unexpectedly. The officer behind the desk handed him a paper. "Parole hearing approved," he said. Daniel froze. He had been waiting for that moment for years, but it still didn't feel real. The officer looked up at him. "You've done good work here. Keep it up and you might just walk out those gates soon." That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about everything that had happened. The fights, the fear, the long nights when he thought he'd never see freedom again. But he also thought about Reed, the people he'd helped, and the quiet moments that had taught him who he really was. When the morning came, he stood by the window again, watching the light touch the floor. For the first time in years, that light didn't feel cold. It felt like hope. The day of his hearing finally arrived. He was nervous but calm. When the board asked him what he had learned during his time inside, Daniel took a deep breath. "I learned that people can change," he said, "not because someone tells them to, but because they finally see what their choices do, to themselves and to others." The room was quiet for a long moment. Then one of the board members nodded slowly. When Daniel walked back to his cell that afternoon, a few of the other inmates asked what happened. He just smiled. "We'll see," he said softly. A few weeks later, the letter arrived. His parole was granted. On his last morning inside, he packed his few things, an old book, Reed's note, and a folded piece of paper from the library. When the gate finally opened and he stepped into the sunlight, the air felt sharp and new. He looked back once at the gray walls that had held him for so long. They looked smaller now, almost fragile. Daniel took a deep breath and walked forward. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was his. And as he moved farther from the place where everything had changed, he understood something simple but true. The day the tables turned inside those prison walls wasn't just about control or rebellion. It was about the moment he learned what freedom really meant.